For 3,000 years, one of the oldest monarchies on earth sat on the throne of Ethiopia. Not 300 years. Not 600 years like the Ottomans. 3,000 years. A dynasty that traced its lineage all the way back to the biblical union of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. A royal house that claimed divine authority not just over a nation, but over an ancient covenant between God and a chosen people. At its height, the Ethiopian Empire commanded the hearts of millions. Its emperor was worshipped as the returned Messiah by a religious movement that spread across the Caribbean, across Africa, across the entire African diaspora. He addressed the League of Nations while the world watched in stunned silence. He appeared on the cover of Time magazine. He was called the conquering lion of the tribe of Judah, the King of Kings, the elect of God. His name was Haile Selassie. And in 1974, a group of low-ranking military officers dragged him from his palace in the back seat of a Volkswagen Beetle. He was never seen in public again. What happened next to Haile Selassie, to his children, to his grandchildren, to the entire House of Solomon, is one of the most heartbreaking, most violent, and most forgotten royal collapses of the 20th century. And almost nobody in the Western world talks about it. So let me take you through the full story of what happened to Ethiopia's imperial family after their empire fell. Because the details are darker, stranger, and more tragic than anything you have probably imagined. To understand the fall, you first need to understand what was actually lost. The Ethiopian monarchy was not simply a political institution. It was a sacred one. Ethiopian emperors did not merely rule their country. They embodied it. The Solomonic dynasty, which Haile Selassie belonged to, claimed an unbroken lineage stretching back to Menelik I, the legendary son of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Whether you accept that claim historically or. For 3,000 years, one of the oldest monarchies on earth sat on the throne of Ethiopia. Not 300 years. Not 600 years like the Ottomans. 3,000 years. A dynasty that traced its lineage all the way back to the biblical union of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. A royal house that claimed divine authority not just over a nation, but over an ancient covenant between God and a chosen people. At its height, the Ethiopian Empire commanded the hearts of millions. Its emperor was worshipped as the returned Messiah by a religious movement that spread across the Caribbean, across Africa, across the entire African diaspora. He addressed the League of Nations while the world watched in stunned silence. He appeared on the cover of Time magazine. He was called the conquering lion of the tribe of Judah, the King of Kings, the elect of God. His name was Haile Selassie. And in 1974, a group of low-ranking military officers dragged him from his palace in the back seat of a Volkswagen Beetle. He was never seen in public again. What happened next to Haile Selassie, to his children, to his grandchildren, to the entire House of Solomon, is one of the most heartbreaking, most violent, and most forgotten royal collapses of the 20th century. And almost nobody in the Western world talks about it. So let me take you through the full story of what happened to Ethiopia's imperial family after their empire fell. Because the details are darker, stranger, and more tragic than anything you have probably imagined. To understand the fall, you first need to understand what was actually lost. The Ethiopian monarchy was not simply a political institution. It was a sacred one. Ethiopian emperors did not merely rule their country. They embodied it. The Solomonic dynasty, which Haile Selassie belonged to, claimed an unbroken lineage stretching back to Menelik I, the legendary son of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Whether you accept that claim historically or. Officers calling themselves the Derg, which simply means committee in Amharic, began organizing in the shadows. They were not idealistic revolutionaries with a clear vision. They were a collection of military men united primarily by opportunism and the shared conviction that the old order had to go. Through 1974, the Derg moved with calculated patience. They arrested government ministers one by one. They stripped the emperor of his powers piece by piece. They turned his own palace staff against him. They broadcast a television documentary called The Hidden Hunger, intercut with footage of the famine and footage of imperial excess, designed specifically to humiliate Haile Selassie and turn public opinion against him. It worked. On September 12, 1974, soldiers arrived at Jubilee Palace in Addis Ababa. Haile Selassie, 82 years old and physically frail, was escorted from the palace and placed in the back of a Volkswagen Beetle. A junior officer reportedly told him he was being removed for the good of the country. The emperor, by all accounts, sat quietly. He did not resist. He did not plead. He was taken to a military barracks. And then he simply disappeared from public view. Before we go further into what happened to the emperor and his family, if you find these buried stories of fallen dynasties as fascinating as I do, go ahead and hit that subscribe button right now. Every subscriber genuinely helps this channel bring more of these hidden histories to light. Now back to the story. Because it gets much darker from here. What happened to Haile Selassie in captivity has never been fully established to the world's satisfaction. He was held at the National Palace in Addis Ababa. For a period, some diplomatic visitors and journalists managed to confirm he was alive. He was reportedly kept in a small room, stripped of all imperial dignity, attended by a much reduced staff. The man who had addressed the United Nations, who had been the spiritual deity of millions of Rastafari believers across the world, who had sat on one of the oldest thrones in human history, was now a prisoner in his own palace. On August 27, 1975, the Ethiopian state radio made a brief announcement. Haile Selassie was dead. He was 83 years old. The official cause given was circulatory failure following a prostate operation. Almost nobody believed it. The Derg, now led by Mengistu Haile Mariam, one of the most brutal dictators of the 20th century, had a powerful motive to silence the emperor permanently. The official story collapsed further in the 1990s when it emerged that Haile Selassie had almost certainly been murdered. His personal physician later stated that no operation had taken place. And in 1992, after the Derg had been overthrown, workers renovating the National Palace made a grim discovery. Beneath the floorboards of Mengistu's private office, they found human remains. DNA testing eventually confirmed they were the remains of Haile Selassie. The King of Kings had been buried under the floor of his murderer's office. His remains were eventually given a state funeral in 2000 and interred at Holy Trinity Cathedral in Addis Ababa, the church he himself had built. But even that process took years of political negotiation and controversy. Some within the Ethiopian Orthodox Church opposed the ceremony. The Rastafari community, for whom Haile Selassie is literally God incarnate, largely refused to accept his death at all. It was an ending so strange, so degrading, and so unresolved that it seemed almost designed to deny him any final dignity. But the emperor's fate, as terrible as it was not the worst thing that happened to the House of Solomon. In November of 1974, just weeks after the emperor was deposed, the Derg arrested 60 former officials of the imperial government. Ministers, generals, aristocrats. These were men who had built their careers serving the monarchy, men who had governed Ethiopia for decades. They were given no trial. No charges were formally read in any court. They were simply executed by firing squad one night and buried in a mass grave. Among those killed were two of Haile Selassie's grandsons by marriage. The massacre, remembered in Ethiopia as the executions of the 60, was the opening act of what would become the Red Terror, one of the most savage political purges in African history. The surviving members of the imperial family were arrested and imprisoned. Haile Selassie's daughter, Princess Tenegnwerk, was held for years under house arrest. His granddaughter, Princess Ichigayu, died in prison under circumstances that were never properly investigated. Multiple members of the extended royal family spent years behind bars, not because of anything they had personally done, but simply because of the blood in their veins. Some fled before the net closed. Crown Princess Volkswagen, Haile Selassie's only surviving son and designated heir, was in Geneva receiving medical treatment when the revolution happened. He never came home. He spent the rest of his life in exile, first in Geneva, then in London, eventually in the United States. In 1989, while still in exile, Volkswagen formally declared himself Emperor Haile Selassie I, a symbolic act that had no political effect whatsoever but carried enormous emotional weight for the Ethiopian diaspora who still believed in the monarchy. He died in Washington, D.C. in 1997, never having set foot in Ethiopia after the revolution. Like the last Ottoman Sultan dying in a borrowed Italian villa, the heir to 3,000 years of Ethiopian monarchy died far from home. The suffering did not stop with the first generation. Princess Sebeldesta, one of Haile Selassie's granddaughters, was imprisoned by the Derg for 14 years. 14 years. She was arrested not because she had been politically active, not because she had taken up arms, but simply because she was who she was. She was eventually released after sustained international pressure and left Ethiopia. She spent years working quietly to keep the memory of her family alive. Other grandchildren scattered across the world. Some went to the United States. Some to Europe. Some to other parts of Africa. They arrived in foreign countries with no money, no recognized status, no political protection, and no realistic prospect of return. Imagine going from palace life in Addis Ababa, surrounded by ceremony, history, and the absolute conviction that your family's throne was as permanent as the mountains surrounding the city, to arriving as a refugee in a foreign country where almost nobody knows or cares who you are. The Ethiopian royal diaspora struggled in ways that were deeply similar to what the Ottoman exiles had experienced half a century earlier. They had been prepared for court life, not ordinary life. The skills that mattered inside the palace walls, protocol, languages, music, horsemanship, had no market value in the economies of 1970s Europe or America. Some found their footing. Some never did. Some members of the extended family fell into poverty, their imperial heritage a story they told their children in small apartments in Alexandria or Washington or Stockholm, a story that felt increasingly distant with every passing year. The Derg's reign of terror lasted until 1991, when rebel forces led by the Tigray People's Liberation Front overthrew Mengistu Haile Mariam. Mengistu himself fled to Zimbabwe, where his old friend Robert Mugabe gave him sanctuary. He lives there still, an old man who has never faced justice for the hundreds of thousands of deaths that occurred under his regime. With the Derg gone, the question of the imperial family's future became complicated in a new way. The new Ethiopian government was a federation of ethnic-based political movements. It had no interest in restoring the monarchy. It had its own legitimacy to build, its own national story to tell. The Solomonic dynasty was acknowledged as history. But it was not invited back into the present. Some family members were permitted to return to Ethiopia. Princess Tenegnwerk, who had survived years of house arrest, was eventually released and died in Addis Ababa in 2003. The state funeral given to Haile Selassie in 2000 was a gesture of partial reconciliation, an acknowledgement that whatever his failures as a ruler, his treatment after deposition had been monstrous. But the palaces were gone. Jubilee Palace is now used as a state guest house. The Grand Palace in Addis Ababa is now the offices of the Prime Minister. The extraordinary personal art collections, the imperial robes, the ceremonial objects of 3,000 years of monarchy, much of it was looted, destroyed, or dispersed during the revolution and its aftermath. Today, the House of Solomon still exists. The current head of the imperial family is Prince Ermia Sala Selassie Haile Selassie, a grandson of the emperor, born in 1960. He lives and works primarily in the United States, where he has been a vocal advocate for Ethiopian democracy and human rights. He heads the Crown Council of Ethiopia, which maintains the institutions and historical memory of the monarchy in an advisory and cultural capacity rather than a political one. He has spoken publicly and movingly about his grandfather, about the revolution, about what was lost and what he hopes Ethiopia can still become. He does not appear to harbor illusions about a restoration. He understands the world he lives in. But he also clearly carries the weight of what his family was and what it endured. Other descendants are scattered across the United States, Europe, and Africa. They are doctors, academics, businesspeople, artists. They carry surnames that connect them to Solomon and Sheba, to Menelik and the Ancient Covenant. They carry the memory of a fall that the Western world largely ignored because it happened in Africa, because the Cold War made Mengistu briefly useful to the Soviet Union, and because the story of a deposed African emperor did not fit neatly into the narratives that Western media preferred to tell. Here is what makes the Ethiopian story different from every other royal collapse of the modern era. The Romanovs were murdered quickly and completely. The Habsburgs lost power but retained property and social standing across Europe. The Ottomans were exiled, impoverished, forgotten, but physically survived. The Ethiopian imperial family was imprisoned, murdered, scattered, and then largely ignored by the international community that had once feted their patriarch as a global statesman. Haile Selassie had addressed the United Nations. He had been a founding father of African unity. He had been literally deified by millions of people. And when soldiers put him in the back of a small car and drove him away to die beneath a floorboard, the world barely paused. There is something in that silence that says something uncomfortable about which royal tragedies the world chooses to mourn and which ones it chooses to forget. The House of Solomon was founded in legend and ended in a mass grave and a Volkswagen Beetle. Its surviving members are ordinary citizens now, living ordinary lives in countries far from the highlands of Ethiopia, carrying an extraordinary story that deserves to be far better known than it is. Because this is not just a story about one family. It is a story about what happens when power is stripped away with maximum cruelty and minimum accountability. It is a story about dignity persisting in the face of erasure. It is a story about memory, about who gets to decide which histories matter. And it is a story that, until very recently, almost nobody was telling. If this history moved you the way it moved me, do me a favor and subscribe to the channel. It genuinely helps this work reach more people who deserve to know these stories. Drop a comment below and tell me what you think. Should Haile Selassie be remembered as a visionary leader? A failed emperor, or something far more complicated than either? I will see you in the next one.